There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They don't announce themselves with thunder or a seismic shift. They slip in quietly, dressed in the familiar fabrics of a Tuesday night, smelling of takeout and laundry detergent. You don't recognize them as architecture, as the laying of a foundation for the person you are about to become. You only feel it later, in retrospect, when you trace the lines of your memory back to a single point of pressure, a specific weight against your shoulder, and you realize that was the moment the entire landscape of your world began to tilt, ever so slowly, on its axis. For me, that moment was a quiet hum of a refrigerator and the dead weight of my best friend's head nestled in the crook of my neck. It was a ritual that had become our new normal, a strange and unspoken sacrament in the religion of our friendship. Every night, or near enough, we would collapse onto the worn gray couch in our small apartment, the television casting flickering blue ghosts across our faces. We'd talk about nothing and everything: his frustrating code, my latest photography project, the absurdity of our neighbors, until the conversation dwindled, replaced by the comfortable quiet we had cultivated over years. And then, inevitably, Liam would drift off. His breathing would deepen, his body would lose its tension, and he would list sideways until his head found my shoulder, his hair brushing against my cheek. The first time it happened, my entire body had gone rigid, a statue carved from pure terror, and a feeling so potent it felt like a betrayal. He was just tired, I told myself. He'd just been through a brutal breakup. This was comfort, not a confession. It was platonic. It had to be. But this night was different. The weight felt heavier, more permanent. He had been quiet all evening, a thoughtful, melancholic stillness that had replaced his usual restless energy. He'd been staring at the screen, but I knew he wasn't seeing the movie. I could feel the current of his thoughts from 2 feet away, a turbulent, silent river. When he finally succumbed to sleep, it wasn't a gradual slide, but a surrender. He sighed, a sound so soft it was almost just a texture in the air, and slumped against me, his arm draped loosely over my stomach. My heart, that traitorous muscle, began a frantic, silent drumbeat against my ribs. I was a cartographer of his sleep, mapping the subtle geography of his presence. I knew the exact scent of his shampoo, a mix of sandalwood and something clean, like fresh rain. I knew the way his eyelashes, surprisingly long and dark, brushed against his cheekbones. I knew the faint, rhythmic puff of his breath against the fabric of my t-shirt. I had cataloged these details with the secret, obsessive precision of a man hopelessly in love with his straight best friend. Tonight, though, the details were screaming at me. His hand, resting on my stomach, wasn't just a dead weight. His fingers were slightly curled, as if holding on to something. His body was pressed against mine from shoulder to knee, a line of warmth that felt less like an accident and more like an anchor. I was trapped, not by his weight, but by the sheer, terrifying force of my own hope. A hope I had spent years trying to starve, to lock away in the deepest, most lightless room of my heart. But it was a stubborn, resilient thing, and in moments like this, it would pick the lock and whisper possibilities that were both beautiful and devastating. This, it whispered, feels like coming home. I closed my eyes, inhaling slowly, trying to absorb the moment not as an analyst, but as a participant. I tried to pretend that this was simple, that this was just 2 friends sharing a quiet space. But the truth was a physical thing, a humming wire stretched taut between us. Every inch of my skin was aware of him, every nerve ending a tiny, silent alarm. This was not ordinary. This was the beginning of a fault line. And I had no idea if, when the ground finally gave way, it would be to swallow me whole or to reveal something miraculous buried just beneath the surface. Our story, Liam's and mine, didn't begin with this profound, terrifying silence. It began with noise, with the chaotic energy of a university elective we were both forced to take. Introduction to Art History. I was there because it was a requirement for my fine arts degree in photography, a world of quiet observation, of capturing light and shadow. He was there because his computer science advisor told him he needed a humanities credit, and this one fit into his schedule between advanced algorithms and a class that, to this day, I can only describe as is something with numbers. Liam was a supernova in that drab lecture hall. He was all bright, easy smiles and a laugh that made you want to laugh with him, even if you hadn't heard the joke. He had a way of leaning forward when you spoke, his brow furrowed in concentration, that made you feel like you were the only person in the universe. It was a gravitational pull, and I, a quiet planet in a distant orbit, was drawn in immediately. We became friends through a mutual acquaintance who eventually faded into the background, leaving the two of us as the primary celestial bodies in our own small solar system. Our friendship was built in the late hours, fueled by cheap coffee and a shared sense of being slightly out of sync with the world around us. He was a brilliant coder, a man who saw the world in elegant, logical systems. Yet he was possessed by a deep, creative restlessness he couldn't quite articulate. I was a photographer, a man who saw the world in frozen moments of emotional truth, yet I was often paralyzed by the fluid, illogical chaos of my own feelings. We were two halves of a whole, though I was the only one who knew it. He would talk for hours about the beauty of a perfectly structured piece of code, the way a complex problem could be broken down into simple, beautiful solutions. I would listen, fascinated, trying to see the art in his logic. In return, I would show him my photographs, portraits of strangers, desolate landscapes, studies of light falling on forgotten objects. He would look at them with that same intense focus, tracing the lines with his eyes, and he would see things I hadn't even noticed myself. "It's lonely," he said once, looking at a photo I'd taken of a single, bare tree against a vast, white sky. "But it's not sad. It's patient." He understood my language without ever having learned it. The moment I knew I was in love with him wasn't a lightning strike. It was more like the slow, magical process of a photograph appearing in a darkroom tray. It was 1,000 tiny moments, 1,000 shared glances and late-night conversations, developing over time into a single, undeniable image. It was the time he showed up at my dorm room with a thermos of soup when I had the flu, sitting on the edge of my bed and reading aloud from a terrible fantasy novel until I fell asleep. It was the way his eyes would find mine across a crowded party, a silent check-in that said, "Are you okay? Do you want to leave?" It was the day he helped me hang my first gallery show, meticulously measuring the distance between frames, his brow furrowed with a seriousness he usually reserved for his most complex coding projects. He treated my art, my heart, with a reverence I had never known. That day, standing in the quiet gallery, the smell of fresh paint in the air, I watched him step back to admire our work, a proud smile on his face, and the image in my heart became sharp and clear. I was in love with him, and it was a hopeless, beautiful, agonizing truth. Because Liam, my brilliant, kind, and wonderful Liam, was devastatingly straight. His life was a string of girlfriends, each one seemingly lovelier than the last. There was Emily in first year, who chewed her hair. There was Chloe in third year, who had a laugh like wind chimes. And then there was Sarah. Sarah was different. She was serious, ambitious, a law student who matched Liam's drive and intelligence. They were a perfect couple, the kind of pair you see and just nod, thinking, yes, that makes sense. They moved in together after graduation. They adopted a cat. They talked about the future in a way that was both casual and concrete. For 4 years, I was the third wheel, the best friend, the permanent fixture in their lives. I was the one Liam called when he and Sarah had a fight. I was the one who helped him pick out her birthday presents. I was the keeper of his secrets, the historian of his heart, all while my own heart was quietly breaking, over and over again. I learned to build walls within myself, intricate structures of self-preservation. I compartmentalized my love for him, storing it in a locked room, visiting it only in the dead of night when I was alone and safe from exposure. My friendship with him was too precious to risk. It was the sun I orbited, and even if I could never touch it, I needed its warmth to survive. To confess my feelings would be to shatter our universe, to send us both spinning off into a cold, empty darkness. So I smiled, I listened, and I perfected the art of being just a friend. The shift came, as they so often do, not with a whisper, but with a wrecking ball. It was a Tuesday in October when Liam called me, his voice a raw, broken thing I had never heard before. "She's gone," was all he said. Sarah had left. It wasn't a fight that had escalated. It was a slow erosion he hadn't seen coming. She had packed her bags while he was at work, leaving a note on the kitchen counter next to the cat's food bowl. The note, he told me later, was kind, logical, and utterly brutal. She loved him, but she wasn't in love with him. She felt like they were just roommates, two life partners running a household, the passion long since faded into comfortable routine. She needed more. He read the letter to me over the phone, his voice catching on the polite, sterile words. And in that moment, all I could feel was a profound, hollow ache for him. My own selfish, hidden heart was silent, eclipsed by the sheer force of his pain. He moved into my spare room 2 days later. It was supposed to be temporary, just until he found a new place, until he got his feet back under him. The room was small, mostly filled with my photography equipment and boxes of old prints, but we cleared a space for a mattress on the floor. In those first few weeks, he was a ghost haunting our apartment. He'd sit on the couch for hours, staring at nothing, the vibrant energy that had always defined him completely extinguished. He barely ate. He barely slept. My role as his friend became my entire existence. I made him food he wouldn't eat. I dragged him out for walks he didn't want to take. I sat with him in the crushing silence, just offering my presence as a bulwark against the vast emptiness Sarah had left behind. I was a lighthouse keeper, my single beam of light fixed on his ship, trying to guide him through the storm and back to some semblance of a safe harbor. It was during this time that the lines began to blur, that the carefully constructed walls of my self-preservation began to show cracks. He started to need a different kind of comfort, something more tangible than words or shared silence. It began subtly. We'd be watching a movie, and his foot would press against mine. I would flinch internally, but force myself to remain still, telling myself it was an accident, a simple consequence of sharing a small couch. But it kept happening. Then, one night, he was particularly low, hollowed out by a wave of grief. He was talking about a memory with Sarah, a trip they'd taken, and his voice cracked and dissolved into ragged sobs. I did what any friend would do. I put my arm around his shoulders, a clumsy, awkward gesture. But instead of pulling away, he leaned into it, burying his face in my shoulder, his body shaking with silent, racking grief. I just held him, my hand resting on his back, feeling the frantic beat of his heart through his shirt. It felt like holding a shattered piece of porcelain together with my bare hands, praying the pieces would fuse. He cried for what felt like an eternity, and when he was done, he didn't move. He just stayed there, tucked against me, his breathing slowly evening out. He fell asleep like that, a dead weight of sorrow and trust against my side. That was the first time. It felt monumental, a crossing of some invisible threshold. But it was born of his pain, and I could assign it no other meaning. It was an act of desperation on his part, an act of compassion on mine. I told myself this, repeated it like a mantra, but a seed had been planted in the barren ground of my hope. And in the weeks that followed, it began to sprout. The couch became our sanctuary, our confessional, our space of unspoken negotiation. The pretense of watching movies became just that, a pretense. It was an excuse to sit together in the dark, to let the boundaries between us soften and dissolve. He was healing, slowly. The raw, open wound of the breakup was beginning to scar over. The ghost in our apartment was starting to regain his color, his substance. His laugh, when it came, was still rare, but it was real. Yet, the need for physical comfort didn't recede with his grief. If anything, it intensified. It was no longer a desperate grasp in a moment of crisis. It was becoming a habit, a ritual. The ritual of the couch was a masterpiece of plausible deniability. It was a silent agreement built on a foundation of ambiguity, and I was its most devoted and most tortured student. It never began with an explicit request. It would start with a shared sigh at the end of a long day, a mutual migration from the kitchen to the living room. We'd sink into the cushions, a respectable distance between us, and the blue light of the television would wash over us. For a while, that distance would hold, a fragile testament to the platonic nature of our cohabitation. But the space between us had its own gravitational pull. It would shrink, inch by imperceptible inch. A foot would nudge mine. A knee would come to rest against my own. These were the opening moves in a game whose rules I didn't understand, a game I was terrified I was inventing all on my own. I would sit there, my body a live wire, my mind a frantic torrent of analysis. Was that intentional? Is he even aware he's doing it? If I move my leg, will he think it's a rejection? If I don't, am I giving him the wrong idea? My inner monologue was a constant, exhausting debate between the prosecutor, who argued that every touch was a meaningless twitch of a sleeping man, and the defense attorney, who presented every lingering contact as evidence of something deeper. Then came the escalation. One evening, after a particularly grueling week at his new consulting job, he was exhausted beyond measure. He slumped onto the couch beside me, his head lolling back against the cushion. "I don't think I can move," he mumbled, his eyes already closed. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the low murmur of a documentary about deep-sea life. I felt him shift, a small, deliberate movement. Then, his head was on my shoulder. It wasn't the collapsing surrender of grief anymore. It was a choice. My breath caught in my throat. I waited for him to pull back, to realize what he'd done and retreat to his side of the couch with an awkward laugh. But he didn't. He settled in, nuzzling his face into the curve of my neck like a cat seeking warmth. He sighed, a sound of pure, unadulterated contentment, and I felt the sound vibrate through my collarbone, directly into my heart. My own body, against all my commands for it to remain neutral, to remain statuesque, betrayed me. I relaxed. My shoulders softened to better accommodate his head. My own head tilted slightly, resting against his. We fit. We fit together like two puzzle pieces that had been searching for each other, and the rightness of it was a physical ache in my chest. From that night on, the pretense of accidental contact was abandoned, replaced by the pretense of sleep. Sleep was Liam's excuse, his cover story, his get-out-of-jail-free card. He would fall asleep on me nearly every night. Sometimes he would drape an arm over my chest, his hand resting just above my heart. I would lie there, feeling the steady rhythm of my own pulse under his palm, wondering if he could feel the frantic, hopeful message it was hammering out in Morse code. "I love you. I love you. I love you." Other times, he would shift in his sleep, wrapping a leg around mine, pulling our lower bodies into an intimate tangle. The heat of him, the solid, living weight of him, was both a profound comfort and an exquisite form of torture. It was everything I had ever wanted, offered to me in a form I couldn't fully accept or understand. Was he dreaming? Was he conscious on some level, aware of what he was doing, what he was asking for? Or was I just a convenient, human-shaped pillow? I became an expert in the subtleties of his breathing, the slight flutter of his eyelids. I tried to decipher the language of his unconscious body. There were nights I was certain he was awake, that his stillness was too deliberate, his breathing too controlled. In those moments, a terrifying, exhilarating thought would seize me. He knows. He knows what this is, and he is choosing it. He is here, with me, on purpose. But then he would stir, mumbling something incoherent, and shift away, and the theory would crumble, leaving me alone again with my uncertainty. I lived in a state of perpetual, high-alert limbo. My apartment, my home, had transformed into a space of immense vulnerability. Every evening held the potential for either heartbreaking disappointment or a quiet, earth-shattering miracle. The couch was our stage, our battlefield, our shared territory of unspoken needs. I never initiated. I never asked for more. I was a patient observer, the photographer waiting for the perfect, fleeting moment of truth to reveal itself. I would let him lead, even if he was leading us in his sleep. I would wait. The hope was agonizing, but the thought of returning to a world without this, without the weight of him against me, was simply unbearable. The ritual was all I had. My camera became my only confidant. In the quiet hours of the morning, After I'd managed to untangle myself from a sleeping Liam and retreat to my own cold bed, I would slip into the small, cramped space I used as a darkroom. The red safe light cast a warm, forgiving glow over everything, like the inside of a heart. I started a new project, one I knew I could never show anyone, especially not him. I began taking photographs of the aftermath of our ritual. The indentation his head left on the couch cushion. The rumpled blanket, still holding the shape of our entangled limbs. A single coffee mug he'd left on the side table, a faint lipstick-less smudge on the rim. I was documenting the evidence of his presence, the ghost of our intimacy. It was a way of making it real, of proving to myself that I hadn't imagined it. In the chemical bath, the images would slowly emerge from the blank paper, apparitions taking form. A close-up of the worn fabric of his favorite gray hoodie, left draped over the arm of the couch. The spine of a book he'd been reading, his thumbprint a faint smudge on the page. These were my secret love letters, my silent testament to the space we occupied together. They were portraits of him, but without his face. They were landscapes of our shared life, maps of an emotional territory that had no name. Developing these photos was the only way I could process the overwhelming surge of feeling that had no other outlet. It was a way of containing the hope, of giving it a physical form, so it wouldn't consume me completely. The ritual wasn't confined to the couch. It began to bleed into the other corners of our life. Our apartment was small, a railroad-style layout where you had to walk through one room to get to the next. My bedroom was at the very back, offering the most privacy. His was in the middle, a pass-through space that connected the living room to my room and the bathroom. In the beginning, he was meticulous about closing his door. It was a clear boundary, a demarcation of space. This is mine, that is yours, but after the breakup, after the grief had settled in, the door started to change its behavior. At first, it was just left slightly ajar. I'd walk past on my way to the bathroom late at night and see a sliver of his room, a slice of darkness. I told myself it was nothing, that he'd just forgotten. But then the gap widened. The door would be left halfway open, an invitation I didn't know how to read. I would see him in his bed, a lump under the covers, the faint glow of his phone casting a small pool of light on his face. My heart would pound in my chest as I passed, my steps quiet on the old wooden floors. It felt like an act of profound trust on his part, and an act of voyeurism on mine. Then came the nights he couldn't sleep. I'd find him in the kitchen at 2 a.m, staring into the open refrigerator as if the answers to the universe were hidden behind the milk carton. He looked younger in the stark, cold light, his face stripped of its daytime mask of competence. "Can't shut my brain off," he'd whisper, as if we were in a library. I'd make us both tea, chamomile, the steam fogging up the window pane. We'd sit at the small kitchen table, our knees almost touching, and talk in low voices. He'd talk about the pressure of his job, the feeling of being an imposter. He'd talk about his family, his distant father, his overbearing mother. He never talked about Sarah anymore. It was as if that chapter of his life had been filed away, a closed case. He was talking about himself, about the deep, foundational loneliness that had been there long before she left. And I would listen, offering nothing but my quiet, unwavering attention. In these moments, I felt closer to him than ever before. There was no pretense, no sleeping bodies to interpret. It was just us, two souls adrift in the quiet of the night, finding a temporary anchor in each other. One night, after one of these late-night talks, as we were heading back to our respective rooms, he stopped in his doorway. He was still holding his empty mug. He looked at his bed, then he looked at me, his expression lost and vulnerable. "My room feels so empty," he said, the words barely audible. It wasn't a question, but it hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken need. My entire being screamed at me to say it, to offer it. "You can stay with me," the words were right there, on the tip of my tongue, a flock of birds ready to take flight. But the fear of what that would mean, of crossing a line so definitively, held them back. What if I was misreading everything? What if he just meant he was lonely, and my offer would turn his simple, sad confession into something awkward and charged? The moment stretched, taut and shimmering. I was a coward. I gave him a small, sad smile. "I know," I said softly. "Try to get some sleep," he nodded, a flicker of disappointment in his eyes that I might have imagined, and disappeared into his room, closing the door, but not quite latching it. I stood in the hallway for a long time, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I had failed a test I didn't even know I was taking. The door was open, and I had been too afraid to walk through. The tension in the apartment grew, but it wasn't an unpleasant tension. It was the feeling of the air before a storm, charged and electric with possibility. The ambiguity of our ritual had become a character in our home, a third roommate who was both a comfort and a constant source of anxiety. We were living in a liminal space, no longer just friends, but not yet anything more. I found myself watching him constantly, not just for signs of affection, but for signs of his own awareness. I saw the way his eyes would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking. I noticed him adopting my phrases, my way of tilting my head when I was listening intently. We were mirroring each other, our orbits syncing up in subtle, powerful ways. He started bringing me things: a perfect seashell he found on a run by the water, a book of photography by an artist he thought I'd like, a specific brand of dark chocolate he noticed I always bought. These were not grand gestures. They were small, quiet offerings, pebbles dropped into the deep well of our shared silence. Each one was a question I didn't know how to answer. The crossing happened on a Thursday. It had been a terrible day for him. A major project at work had imploded, and he had taken the brunt of the blame. He came home looking defeated, his shoulders slumped, the bright light in his eyes dimmed to a pilot light. He didn't want to talk about it. He just dropped his bag by the door, stripped off his work clothes, and collapsed onto the couch in his worn sweats and a t-shirt. I ordered his favorite pizza, the one with extra pepperoni and black olives that I secretly hated. We ate in near silence, the television murmuring in the background. His sadness was a physical presence in the room, a heavy fog that muted all the colors. When we were done, he pushed the pizza box onto the floor and immediately curled up against me, his face pressed into my side, his arm wrapping tightly around my waist. There was no slow, gradual slide. There was no pretense of falling asleep. It was a direct, immediate act of seeking refuge. He was hiding from the world, and he had chosen me as his hiding place. I put my arm around him, pulling him closer, resting my chin on the top of his head. His hair was soft against my skin. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, the movie playing out to an empty audience. The weight of him was different this time. It wasn't just comfort, it was possession. He was holding on to me as if he were drowning. I could feel the tension in his body, the tight coil of anxiety in his muscles. I started rubbing his back, slow, steady circles, the way you would soothe a frightened child. Under my hand, I felt him begin to relax, the knots of stress slowly unspooling. His breathing deepened, and for a while, I thought he had finally fallen asleep. The apartment was completely still, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside our window. I was in that familiar state of peaceful torture, my heart full to bursting, my mind a tangled mess of what-ifs. Then he moved. He lifted his head from my side and looked at me. His eyes, in the dim light from the television, were wide and dark and full of something I had never seen before. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't grief. It was something raw and vulnerable and utterly terrifying. His face was only inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my lips. My own breathing stopped. The entire universe seemed to shrink down to the space between our faces. This was it. The fault line. The ground was trembling beneath us. He didn't look away. His gaze was locked on mine, searching for something. An answer? Permission? I had no idea. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. "Leo," he whispered, my name a fragile thing in the quiet room. "Yeah." I managed to breathe out, my voice raspy. He hesitated, his eyes flicking down to my mouth and then back up to my eyes. The air crackled. The silence was so loud it was a roar. "Can I ask you something weird?" he said, his voice barely a murmur. This was it. The question. The moment that would change everything, for better or for worse. The locked room in my heart burst open, and all the hope I had so carefully contained came flooding out. I could have stopped it. I could have made a joke, broken the tension, retreated to the safety of our friendship. But I was so tired of being safe. I was so tired of being a silent observer. I wanted to be in the photograph, not just taking it. I nodded, unable to speak. He took a slow, shaky breath. Would it be? Would it be okay? He started, his voice cracking slightly. If I kissed you? The question hung in the air, a perfect, terrifying sphere of glass. If I said no, it would shatter, and the pieces would cut us both. If I said yes, it would transform, become something solid and real that we could never undo. All the nights of analysis, all the fear, all the desperate hope, it all came down to this single, monosyllabic choice. He was giving me the power. He was laying his own vulnerability at my feet, a trembling offering. And in his eyes, I saw it all. The confusion, the fear, but underneath it all, a sliver of the same desperate hope that lived in me. He wasn't just seeking comfort. He was seeking me. 1,000 years passed in the space of a single heartbeat. Then, I heard a voice, my own, but it sounded distant, as if it were coming from across a great chasm. Yes, the aftermath was not the gentle, sunlit meadow I might have fantasized about. It was a minefield of silence and averted gazes. The kiss itself had been impossibly soft, a tentative, questioning press of lips that felt more like a confession than a conquest. It was hesitant and chaste, yet it was the most intimate thing I had ever experienced. When he pulled back, his eyes were wide with a kind of dazed wonder, and a fear so profound it mirrored my own. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a long moment, then laid his head back down on my chest, tucked his face into my neck, and was silent. We fell asleep like that, tangled together on the couch, two soldiers clinging to each other in the trench after the battle was over. But when I woke up in the gray light of dawn, I was alone. A blanket was tucked neatly around me, and a glass of water was on the coffee table. Of Liam, there was no sign. The apartment, which had been our shared sanctuary, became a territory of unspoken tension. I heard him get up and leave for work before I was even out of bed, a quiet click of the front door his only goodbye. The air was thick with what had happened, with what hadn't been said. When he came home that evening, he was armed with a brittle, forced cheerfulness that was more alarming than any silence. He talked loudly about his day, about a ridiculous email chain, about the weather. He didn't look at me. Not once. He kept his body angled away from me, creating a physical barrier in the open space of our living room. He was building a wall, brick by painful brick, right in front of my eyes. The couch, our sacred space, went unused. He claimed he had work to do and disappeared into his room, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of the apartment. My hope, which had soared to such dizzying heights, crashed and burned. The pain was a physical thing, a cold, heavy ache in my solar plexus. I had been a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. The couch ritual, the open door, the late-night talks. I had painted them with the colors of my own desire, seeing a masterpiece where there was only a blank canvas. He had been lonely and grieving, and I had been a warm body, a convenient port in a storm. The kiss hadn't been a revelation for him. It had been a moment of confusion, a mistake, a line he now deeply regretted crossing. I was an experiment, a momentary lapse in his otherwise straight, predictable life. The thought was humiliating, a deep, searing shame that made my skin feel too tight. I had let him in, had demolished all my own defenses, only to be left standing in the rubble alone. For 2 days, we lived as polite strangers. We exchanged pleasantries in the kitchen, our movements choreographed to avoid any accidental contact. Morning, did you sleep well? Need anything from the store? The questions were empty shells, devoid of the warmth and intimacy that had once defined our every interaction. I watched him, and I saw a man wrestling with a ghost. He looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed, his movements jerky and uncertain. He was running from the memory of that kiss, and by extension, he was running from me. The hurt inside me began to curdle, solidifying into a hard knot of anger. It wasn't just that he was pulling away. It was that he was refusing to grant me the dignity of an explanation. He was trying to erase it, to pretend that the most honest moment we had ever shared had never happened. And I couldn't let him do that. Not to me, and not to us. Our friendship, the real, deep, foundational friendship that existed long before any of this, deserved better than to be killed by a coward's silence. On the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. He was in the kitchen, making himself a sandwich with a methodical, joyless precision. I walked in and stood by the counter, my arms crossed over my chest, a defensive posture I didn't even realize I was taking. He didn't look up. "Hey," he mumbled, his focus entirely on spreading mustard onto a slice of bread. "Liam," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "We need to talk." He froze, the knife hovering over the bread. He still didn't look at me. "I'm kind of tired, Leo. Can it wait?" "No," I said, the word sharper than I intended. "It can't." He let out a long, weary sigh and finally, lifted his head and met my eyes. The man I saw in front of me was a stranger. He looked hunted, his face pale, his eyes filled with a desperate, cornered fear. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice flat. "Nothing to talk about." I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping me. "You kissed me, Liam. You asked me if you could kiss me, and then you did. And for 2 days, you've been acting like I have the plague. You think that's nothing?" He winced, flinching as if my words were physical blows. He put the knife down on the counter with a clatter. "Look, I'm sorry," he said, turning away from me, running a hand through his hair. It was weird. I was having a bad day. I was confused. It was a mistake. A mistake. The word landed in the center of my chest and detonated. All the air rushed out of my lungs. "A mistake," I echoed, my voice dangerously quiet. "Was it a mistake all those nights on the couch? Was it a mistake when you fell asleep on me? Was it a mistake to leave your door open? Was all of it just one big, long mistake?" I was interrogating him, and I hated the sound of my own voice, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know. I needed to understand the architecture of my own heartbreak. He whipped around, his face a mask of anguish. "I don't know," he shouted, the sound shocking in our quiet apartment. "Okay, I don't know. I don't know what any of it means." He paced the small kitchen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I just know that my life was this one, straight, predictable line. I knew who I was. I knew what I wanted. And then Sarah left, and everything fell apart, and you. You were just there. You were solid. You were quiet. And being near you it felt like the only real thing in the world." He stopped pacing and leaned against the counter, his head bowed. He looked utterly defeated. I don't feel this way about guys," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, broken whisper. "I don't. But with you, it's different. That night, on the couch, kissing you, it didn't feel like a mistake. In the moment, it felt like the most honest thing I've ever done in my entire life." He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "And that scares the hell out of me, Leo. Because I don't know what to do with it. I don't know who I am if I'm the guy who is in love with his best friend." He said it. He actually said the words. Not "I have feelings for you" or "I care about you," he said in love. The anger in me evaporated, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a whole new landscape of his own identity, and he was terrified of the fall. The silence that followed his confession was different. It wasn't empty or tense. It was full. It was the quiet after the storm has passed, the air clean and smelling of rain. I walked over to him, closing the small distance between us. He watched me, his expression wary, vulnerable. I didn't reach for him. I just stood in front of him, letting him see the truth in my own eyes. "You don't have to know who you are right now," I said softly. "You don't have to have it all figured out. You have to stop running." I took a breath, the confession that I had held inside for years finally rising to the surface, simple and undeniable. "I love you too, Liam. I have for a long time. And it's okay to be scared. But you're not alone in it. We can be scared together." His face crumpled, the last of his defenses giving way. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't say anything. He just took one step forward and wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my shoulder. I held him tightly, my own eyes closing. It wasn't the desperate, grasping hold from the couch. It was a mutual anchor. He wasn't hiding from the world anymore. He was coming home. And in the quiet of our kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of our old friendship and the fragile, terrifying promise of something new, we just stood there and held on, letting the silence heal us. The conversation in the kitchen did not magically solve everything. It was not a finish line, but a starting gate. It opened a door that we had both been afraid to even touch, and what lay on the other side was not a perfectly furnished room, but a space that needed to be built, board by board, together. We agreed to take it slow, a pace dictated by the rhythm of his fear and my patience. The words boyfriend or dating were never used. They felt too large, too formal, like suits that didn't fit. Instead, we spoke in a language of action and intention. The brittle, polite distance that had filled the apartment was replaced by a soft, deliberate tenderness. The couch ritual returned, but it was transformed. It was no longer a negotiation veiled in sleep. It was a choice, made with open eyes. He would sit down next to me, and after a moment, he would look at me, a silent question in his eyes. I would nod, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and he would lean against me, his head finding its familiar place on my shoulder. It was a conscious act of trust, a daily reaffirmation of the new ground we were treading. Sometimes, in the middle of a movie, I would feel his hands search for mine, his fingers lacing through my own. The first time it happened, my heart did its familiar, frantic leap, but this time it was followed by a profound sense of peace. His hand in mine felt like a period at the end of a very long, very complicated sentence. It felt like a fact. The architecture of our home life shifted. The closed door to his bedroom became a thing of the past. It was always open now, a symbol of the collapsed barriers between us. One night, I woke from a bad dream, my heart pounding, the echoes of it still clinging to me. I got up to get a glass of water, and as I passed his room, I saw him stir. He sat up, his hair a mess in the moonlight filtering through his window. "You okay?" he whispered into the darkness. I just shook my head, not trusting my voice. "Come here," he said, his voice thick with sleep. He shifted over, making space for me in his bed. I hesitated for only a second before climbing in beside him. The mattress was small, and we were pressed together from shoulder to ankle. He didn't try to hold me or kiss me. He just lay there beside me, his presence a warm, solid wall against the lingering shadows of my dream. I felt his breathing even out, and soon, mine followed. I fell asleep to the sound of his heartbeat, a steady, reassuring rhythm in the quiet of the night. It wasn't about sex or passion. It was about safety. It was about the profound, elemental comfort of not being alone in the dark. We began to build a new life out of small, quiet moments of domesticity. We started cooking together, navigating the tiny kitchen in a clumsy, laughing dance. He learned that I hated doing dishes, so he would do them without being asked, his hands submerged in the soapy water while I dried. I learned that he couldn't make coffee to save his life, so I took over the morning ritual, the scent of fresh grounds becoming the first thing we shared each day. We would stand in the kitchen in the early morning light, sipping from our mugs, our shoulders brushing, the silence comfortable and full. These were the bricks of our new foundation. They were small, seemingly insignificant acts of service and care, but together they were building something strong, something that could withstand the weight of our past and the uncertainty of our future. His fear did not vanish overnight. It was a ghost that still haunted the edges of our new reality. There were days he would grow quiet, a familiar shadow passing over his eyes, and I knew he was wrestling with it. He was recalibrating his entire sense of self, a process that was painful and disorienting. He was afraid of what his family would say, of what his friends would think. He was afraid of the labels, of the identity he was being forced to confront. In those moments, I learned to give him space, to not push or demand reassurance. I would simply be there, a quiet, steady presence, a reminder that he was not going through this alone. I would make him tea, or put on a record he loved, or simply sit with him on the couch, our knees touching, a silent promise that I wasn't going anywhere. I was learning that love wasn't just about the grand, cinematic moments of confession. It was about the quiet, patient work of holding space for someone else's fear. My photography changed, too. I stopped taking pictures of the absence of him, of the ghosts of our intimacy. I started taking pictures of him. I took a photo of his hands, calloused from the gym, but gentle as they fixed the broken strap on my camera bag. I took a photo of the back of his neck as he stood at the window, looking out at the rain. I took a photo of him laughing, his head thrown back, his eyes crinkling at the corners, a rare and beautiful sight that felt like a personal victory. These were not the lonely, melancholic images of my past work. They were full of life, of warmth, of a quiet, hesitant joy. My art was no longer about documenting loneliness. It was about charting the geography of love. He would watch me as I worked, a small, curious smile on his face. He never asked to see the photos. He seemed to understand that they were my way of processing, my way of saying the things I couldn't yet articulate. One Saturday afternoon, we were lying on the living room floor, surrounded by piles of books we were supposed to be sorting. The sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He was quiet, tracing the patterns on the old wooden floor with his finger. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft. "Miss what?" I asked, looking over at him. "The way things were," he said. "Just easy, simple. When we were just friends and none of this was complicated." I thought about it for a moment, about the years of quiet, unrequited love, the constant ache of wanting something I believed I could never have. I thought about the carefully constructed walls, the loneliness of my secret. "No," I said, my voice full of a certainty that surprised me. "It wasn't simple for me, Liam. It was never simple. It was just quiet. This," I said, gesturing to the space between us, to the sunlit room, to the life we were building, "is complicated. And it's scary, but it's honest. I'll take honest over simple any day." He turned his head and looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw something shift, a final piece clicking into place. He reached out and cupped my cheek, his thumb stroking my skin. "Honest," he repeated, as if testing the word. He leaned in and kissed me, and this time, there was no hesitation, no question. It was a kiss of profound, quiet certainty. It was a kiss that tasted of sunlight and dust and the promise of 1,000 more Saturday afternoons. It was the feeling of a door not just being left open, but being taken off its hinges entirely. We never had another grand, soul-bearing conversation about what we were. We didn't need to. The answer was in the way he started referring to my room as our room. It was in the way we seamlessly merged our groceries, our laundry, our lives. It was in the way we would fall asleep in the same bed every night, not out of need or loneliness, but out of a simple, profound desire to be near each other. The change was so gradual, so organic, that I barely noticed it happening. One day, we were two friends navigating a terrifying new landscape, and the next, we were simply home. The world outside our apartment, with its labels and its expectations, still existed, but it seemed quieter now, its volume turned down. What mattered was the truth we had built within these four walls. There are moments in your life that are not disguised at all. They are clear and bright and undeniable. They are the moments you realize that the foundation you felt being laid in the dark was not for a single room, but for a cathedral. It was for a space large enough to hold all of your fear, all of your hope, all of your love. For me, that moment is now. It is every morning when I wake up to the sound of his breathing beside me. It is every evening when we sit on the couch, his hand in mine, the silence between us no longer a question, but an answer. We began in a state of unspoken things, of gestures and ambiguities. But it was in the beautiful, honest silence we learned to create together that we finally found the words, and we began to heal.